There's a specific kind of person almost every neighborhood has, and you've probably clocked one without ever quite putting your finger on it. She drives the same car for a decade past when most of us would have traded it in already. She never mentions what anything costs. She doesn't post the trip, the renovation, the new anything. And yet, if you ever actually saw her account balances, you'd be stunned because none of it matches the picture she puts out into the world. That mismatch isn't an accident, and it isn't luck. It's about 10 specific, honestly kind of boring little habits repeated for years without ever really changing. I'm Alora, and this is the Finance Mom HQ, where we talk about the money stuff nobody ever actually sits moms down to explain. Today I want to walk through all 10 of these habits with you, not as some vague just be better with money advice, but as the real specific mechanics behind why they work. The math, the psychology, and the exact decisions that separate a mom who looks fine from a mom who actually is. Before we get into the list, I want to name the one thread that runs through every single habit on it, because once you see it, the rest of this will click into place fast. None of these 10 things are about earning more money. They're about setting your life up so the good decision is the easy one, and the bad decision takes actual effort to reach. Willpower is unreliable. It's strong on a Monday morning and completely gone by Friday night after the week you've had. Every habit on this list works precisely because it doesn't lean on willpower at all. It leans on structure instead. Hold on to that idea as we go, because it's really the one thing running quietly underneath everything else on this list. I say this as someone who used to genuinely believe money management was mostly a personality trait, that some people were just naturally good with money, the way some people are naturally good at math. And I clearly wasn't one of them. It took me embarrassingly long to realize that almost nobody who looks calm about money got there by having more willpower than me. They got there by needing less of it, because the structure was doing the work instead. That reframe alone changed how I approached every single habit on this list. And I think it'll change how you hear the next 10 minutes too. Habit 1, and honestly, the one everything else gets built on top of, is paying yourself first. Most of us structure our finances backwards without ever realizing it. Paycheck lands, bills get paid, groceries get bought, life happens, and whatever's left over at the end of the month, if there's anything left at all, is what we call savings. The problem is that whatever's left is almost always close to zero, because spending has this quiet way of expanding to fill however much room you give it. That's not a character flaw. That's just what happens when spending is allowed to go first and saving is left to fight for the scraps. Paying yourself first flips that whole order around. The second income lands, a fixed amount, ideally a percentage, not a flat number, so it grows right along with your income, moves automatically into savings and investing before a single bill or grocery run even happens. The bills and the fun spending then have to work around whatever's left, instead of savings being the thing squeezed into whatever's left. It sounds like a small technicality, but it changes everything. Picture a mom bringing home $5,000 a month who sets up an automatic transfer of $600, roughly 12%, the second that paycheck clears. She never even sees that $600 sitting in her checking account. It never gets the chance to feel available. And here's the honest truth about how we're wired. Money that never touches your hands is so much easier to leave alone than money that's just sitting there for 2 weeks, tempting you every time you check your balance. Over 30 years at typical market returns, that one automated habit alone, with absolutely nothing else changing about her income or spending, can grow into a 7-figure account. Not because she was more disciplined than the rest of us, because she built a system that made discipline beside the point. I'll be honest, this is the one that took me the longest to actually believe. For years, I told myself I'd save whatever's left once things settled down. And things never once settled down because that's not really how having kids works. The month I finally set up an automatic transfer, the same day my own paycheck landed, I remember feeling almost annoyed at how anticlimactic it was. No willpower required, no white-knuckling it through a sale. The money was just already gone by the time I thought about touching it. A year later, I looked back and realized I hadn't found any extra money at all. I'd just stopped being the one standing between my paycheck and my savings account. Habit 2 I like to call cost per use buying. And it's really just a shift in the one question you ask before you buy anything. Most of us look at a single number, the price tag. The moms I'm describing look at a completely different number, the price divided by how many times that thing will actually get used. A $150 pair of boots worn twice a week for 5 years comes out to roughly 30 cents a wear. A $30 pair that falls apart after 15 wears costs you $2 a wear, almost 7 times more expensive per use, even though the price tag was 5 times smaller. The cheap option, once you look at it this way, was actually the expensive one the whole time. It sounds like a tiny mental trick, and honestly it is, but the effect compounds the same way everything else on this list compounds. Every single purchase you make for the rest of your life runs through this same filter once it becomes automatic, which means you're not making this decision once. You're making it hundreds of times a year, forever, and each time it nudges your money a little further toward things that last and a little further away from things that don't. None of those individual nudges feel like much. 10 years of them adds up to a genuinely different house. And this isn't just about clothes. A kitchen appliance you use every single morning for a decade has a completely different cost per use than some trendy gadget that gets used 4 times and then disappears into a drawer forever. These moms aren't necessarily buying less. Plenty of them buy genuinely nice, sometimes even expensive things. What they're actually doing is running a different calculation before the money ever leaves their account. One based on how much real use they'll get out of something, not just what it costs to walk out the door with it. It quietly turns expensive and cheap into questions about how long something lasts, not just what's printed on the tag. I have a coat I bought years ago that felt genuinely reckless at the time, the kind of price tag that made me stand in the store doing math on my phone before I let myself buy it. I still wear it every winter. Meanwhile, I could probably fill a closet with the reasonable, inexpensive version of things I bought instead, back before I started thinking this way, most of which fell apart or just quietly stopped getting worn within a year. The reckless feeling coat turned out to be the cheap one. The reasonable feeling stuff turned out to be the expensive one. I just couldn't see it at the register. Habit 3 happens at a much bigger scale, and I call it the housing ceiling. This one's a real blind spot for a lot of us because it means trusting a completely different number than the one you're handed. When you apply for a mortgage, a lender tells you the maximum they're willing to approve, based on their risk math, not on your actual life. The moms who quietly build wealth basically ignore that number. Instead, they decide on their own ceiling first, often capping the whole housing cost, mortgage, taxes, insurance, upkeep, all of it, at somewhere around 25 to 30% of take-home pay. And they don't move that number no matter what a lender says they qualify for. Here's why that actually matters so much. The number a lender approves you for is built to see how much your household can technically survive paying, not how much room that leaves you to save, invest, or get through a bad year. Someone who buys right up to their max approved amount often ends up house poor. Every extra dollar swallowed by the house, nothing left over to automate into anything else, no matter how much they bring home. Someone who buys deliberately below that ceiling creates a permanent gap between what they earn and what they're locked into spending. And that gap is exactly where every other habit on this list gets its fuel. The house can look identical from the street. What it feels like to actually live in it is a completely different experience depending on which number you followed. When we were house hunting, the number our lender approved us for was genuinely a little frightening once I sat with it. It was the kind of number that would have meant a beautiful kitchen and absolutely no breathing room anywhere else in our life. We ended up buying well under that, in a smaller house than we technically qualified for, and I remember feeling a little embarrassed about it at the time, like we were settling. Years later, that gap between what we could have spent and what we actually spent is quietly the thing that's funded almost everything else on this list. Habit 4 is the direct cousin of Habit 3, and it's the car ceiling. Cars are almost uniquely dangerous for your money because you're not just spending once. You're spending on something that's losing value the entire time you own it. The rule here is simple. The total price of the car stays at or below roughly half of your annual income, and it gets paid off in a short window, ideally in cash or a very short loan, instead of stretched out to 7 years just to shrink the monthly number. The trap most of us fall into is judging a car by the monthly payment instead of the actual total cost. Stretching a loan from 4 years to 7 years makes the number on the sticker feel smaller, but it dramatically increases the total interest you pay and keeps you tied to a depreciating car for years longer than you needed to be. A car bought within that ceiling and paid off quickly frees up that whole monthly amount, often $500 to $800, to go straight into investing the second the loan disappears. Do that every time you replace a car, across a 30 or 40-year working life, and you end up with entire multi-year stretches where real money is compounding for you, instead of quietly disappearing into interest on something that's worth less every single year. I drove a car with a cracked bumper and a check engine light I'd basically made peace with for way longer than I probably needed to, mostly out of stubbornness about not wanting a payment. When I finally did replace it, I still remember sitting in the finance office and asking for the shorter loan term, even though the monthly number on the longer one looked so much friendlier. It felt worse in the moment. It felt a lot better 2 years later, the exact month that loan disappeared, and that whole payment just quietly redirected itself into my investment account instead. Habit 5 is what I call the built-in delay, or a waiting period rule. This one's almost entirely psychological, but the financial payoff is very real. The rule is a mandatory delay on anything non-essential above a certain dollar amount. Something like a full day for smaller impulse buys and a full 30 days for the bigger discretionary ones. The item goes on a list. If, once the waiting period's up, you still want it and the money's there without messing anything else up, you buy it, completely guilt-free. But more often than you'd think, the want just quietly disappears on its own. This works because so much of our spending comes from a short-lived feeling. Stress, boredom, a perfectly timed ad, comparing our life to someone else's for 5 seconds, instead of a stable, considered want. That feeling almost always fades. A built-in delay doesn't ask you to use willpower to resist buying something in the moment. It just lets time do the resisting for you, since the emotional pull is usually long gone before the waiting period even ends. Moms who actually stick with this often find a big chunk of their waiting list simply gets crossed off a month later, never bought and never missed, freeing up money that would have quietly disappeared into things that never really mattered anyway. I keep a running note in my phone for exactly this, and it is genuinely one of the funniest things I own, because half of what's on there from 30 days ago now reads like it was written by a stranger. Things that felt urgent enough to buy right that second that I can't even remember wanting a month later. The list isn't there to talk me out of anything. It's just there long enough for the feeling to pass on its own, which it almost always does. If any of this is landing so far, I want to tell you quickly why this channel even exists. I started it because I wanted to reach as many moms as I possibly could. Moms nobody ever sat down and actually explained this stuff to, the way nobody sat me down either. Every single person who subscribes brings me one mom closer to that. So if this is useful, hit subscribe, because we've still got 5 more habits to go, and honestly, some of the most important ones are still ahead, including the one that explains why 2 moms earning the exact same salary can end up worlds apart financially 20 years later. Habit 6 is automated investing on a fixed schedule, sometimes called dollar cost averaging, and it's the direct partner to that pay yourself first habit we started with. Once the money's automatically set aside, these moms don't then sit around deciding week to week whether it feels like a good time to invest it. It just goes in, automatically, on the same schedule, into a small handful of low-cost, broadly diversified funds, whether the market that week felt exciting, terrifying, or completely boring. The real benefit here is that it takes timing completely out of your hands, which matters because trying to time things is exactly where most of us lose money compared to just staying invested the whole way through. Putting in the same dollar amount every month means you naturally buy more shares when prices are down and fewer when they're up, with 0 judgment calls required. Over long stretches, this steady approach has consistently beaten people trying to guess the perfect moment to invest a lump sum, mostly because there's no reliable way to know that moment in advance, and every month you spend waiting for a better entry point is a month of compounding you don't get back. This habit isn't clever, it's just consistent, and consistency is doing all the actual work. I used to check my investment account way more than was good for my nervous system, especially on the days the market dropped, and I'd sit there, half convinced I should wait it out before putting more money in. What actually changed things was setting the whole thing to automatic, and then, almost as an act of self-preservation, just not looking as often. The money still goes in on the same day every single month, whether I'm feeling good about the market or not. And at this point, I genuinely couldn't tell you the last time I tried to time anything. Habit 7 is treating your emergency fund as insurance against your own future panic, not as some boring line item you're just supposed to have. Here's the part most of us miss. The emergency fund isn't really there to grow. Its whole job is to sit between a bad month and your investments, so a job loss, a medical bill, or a big repair never forces you to sell your investments at exactly the wrong moment. Without that cushion, a financial shock sets off a rough chain reaction. Investments get sold, often during a downturn when they're already down, turning a temporary dip into a real, locked-in loss. Compounding gets interrupted right when it was starting to build real momentum. And investing itself becomes so stressful that a lot of people just stop doing it altogether after one bad experience. A properly sized emergency fund, usually 3 to 6 months of essential expenses, sometimes more if your income isn't steady, breaks that whole chain before it even starts. What it earns in interest is honestly beside the point. Its real value shows up in the crisis it quietly prevents, the one that never gets photographed and never makes it into anyone's highlight reel, but absolutely shows up years later in the account balance of the mom who had one ready. We had a furnace die on us one January, the kind of repair bill that arrives with no warning and no patience for your timeline. Because there was already a fund sitting there for exactly that kind of thing, the whole event was almost boring. A phone call, a check, a warm house again by the weekend. Nothing got sold, nothing got interrupted, and I didn't think about it again until months later when I was doing our year-end numbers and realized that boring January afternoon had cost us nothing except the money we'd already set aside for it. Habit 8 I call the debt fire alarm rule, treating high-interest debt like an emergency to put out immediately, not a bill you just quietly learn to live with. The reason this matters so much is that compounding runs in reverse against you here. A balance sitting on a typical high-interest credit card grows against you in almost the exact same way an investment grows for you, just pointed the wrong direction. Left alone, a moderate balance can genuinely double in a handful of years from interest alone, quietly wiping out gains you're making everywhere else. These moms tend to come at that imbalance hard. Instead of making minimum payments for years, they'll often redirect extra cash flow, sometimes even pausing investing for a short, defined stretch, specifically to wipe out high-interest debt as fast as possible, because there's no investment return an everyday investor can reliably count on that beats the guaranteed return of getting rid of debt charging double-digit interest. Once it's gone, that whole monthly payment that used to service the debt gets redirected straight into investing, basically handing yourself a permanent raise, funded entirely by no longer paying someone else interest every month. I carried a credit card balance for longer than I'm proud of, the kind that quietly grew every month while I told myself I'd deal with it soon. The month I actually sat down, paused a little of my own investing on purpose, and threw everything extra at it until it was gone, felt almost aggressive compared to how I'd been treating it before. But that fire went out, and it stayed out, and the payment that used to disappear into interest every month has been going into my own account ever since. Habit 9 is deciding what enough actually looks like in advance, and it's your best defense against lifestyle creep. This one's part habit, part mindset, because it means actually writing down real numbers for what a genuinely good life costs your household. Housing, transportation, food, a fair amount of fun and travel. And then treating that number as a target, not as a floor that automatically climbs every time your income does. Here's how it plays out in real life. When a raise comes through, the gap between your old income and your new income doesn't quietly get absorbed into upgraded spending. It gets routed, automatically, into the investing habit from habit 6. A mom who decides what enough looks like at a certain income, and then gets a few raises over the next decade, can end up investing a bigger and bigger share of her income every single year, while her actual day-to-day life looks almost exactly the same the whole time. Two moms earning the exact same salary at the exact same company can end up worlds apart after 20 years just from this one thing. Not because one earned more, but because one let her spending climb right alongside her paycheck, while the other capped it on purpose and redirected the difference. I actually sat down once and wrote out in real numbers what enough looked like for our family. Not a vague feeling, an actual figure for housing and food and the trips we genuinely care about. It felt strange to put a ceiling on something as fuzzy as the good life, almost like I was limiting myself on purpose. But every raise since then has gone somewhere specific, instead of just quietly inflating our everyday spending without either of us really noticing it happening. Habit 10, the last one, is what I call the boring portfolio rule, resisting the urge to make investing feel exciting. There's so much pressure, socially and psychologically, to make investing feel active and clever. Picking individual stocks, chasing whatever's trending, checking your balance constantly, moving money around every time there's news. These moms do basically the opposite. They hold a small handful of low-cost, broadly diversified funds. They rebalance rarely and on a fixed schedule instead of reacting to every headline, and they generally resist the urge to make any dramatic moves in response to short-term noise. Here's what the research on this actually shows. The average investor's own returns tend to lag behind the very funds they're invested in, mostly because of behavior. Buying in after a run-up out of excitement, selling after a drop out of fear, not because the funds themselves are underperforming. A boring portfolio takes almost all of those chances to mess it up off the table, simply because there's so little to actively manage. It won't make for a great story at dinner, but it will, very often, quietly outperform the sophisticated-looking approach over a long enough stretch, just by refusing to add risk and activity to a process that mostly rewards patience. If you looked at my own investment account, you would genuinely be a little bored. It's a small handful of funds I chose years ago and have barely touched since. And I mean that as the highest compliment I can give it. I used to think that was a failure of ambition on my part, like I should have some clever story about a stock I picked at the right moment. I don't have that story. And at this point, I've made peace with the fact that I probably never will, because boring has quietly outperformed every clever thing I ever felt tempted to try. 10 habits, and I know it can feel like a lot to hold in your head all at once, especially if you're hearing several of these for the first time. You don't need all 10 running perfectly by next week. Almost nobody I've ever actually talked to built all of this at once. It's closer to picking one, letting it become boring and automatic, and only then adding the next one on top of it. The order I've walked through them in is roughly the order I'd start in myself if I were building this from zero today. But it's genuinely fine to start wherever feels most possible for your actual life right now. So there they are, all 10, laid out plainly rather than just as vague inspiration. Paying yourself first so saving never depends on willpower, judging purchases by cost per use instead of the price tag, capping housing well below whatever a lender approves, capping the car and paying it off fast instead of stretching the loan, building in a mandatory delay on anything non-essential, automating investments on a fixed schedule no matter what the market's doing, treating your emergency fund as insurance against forced selling, going after high-interest debt like it's actually on fire, deciding what enough looks like in advance so raises get invested instead of absorbed, and keeping your actual investment portfolio boring and simple on purpose. None of these 10 things require a big income to start. None of them require a lucky break, a perfect stock pick, or some dramatic turning point. What they require is a system, built once, and then left alone long enough to just quietly do its job. That's the entire secret hiding behind every quietly wealthy mom you've ever underestimated. Not a secret at all, honestly. Just 10 unglamorous decisions, repeated over and over, for long enough that the results eventually became impossible to ignore, even though none of it ever looked like much of anything from the outside. I think about that mom from the very beginning of this video a lot, the one with the same car for a decade, and the plain jacket, and the calm, let me look at the budget energy at the school pickup line. For a long time, I assumed she started from somewhere I hadn't, some head start the rest of us didn't get. What I've actually come to believe 10 habits later is that she probably just started 10 years before I did, on something that never looked exciting on any single day of it. That's genuinely the whole gap. Not talent, not luck, not a bigger paycheck. Just time, spent on purpose, on something boring enough that nobody ever thought to ask her how she did it. So tell me, out of these 10, which one are you already doing? And which one is the one you've been putting off? Drop it in the comments because I genuinely want to know which of these is the hardest one for people to actually start, not just nod along with. I read every single comment on these, And I'm always a little surprised by which habit ends up being the sticking point for the most people. It's rarely the one I'd have guessed. I'm Alora, and this is the Finance Mom HQ. Raising kids and retirement funds. Go take care of both, and I'll see you in the next one.